Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first-place city. Today we begin the tale of the lumbering era, a remarkable period in the economic history of this area, which began in 1870 and continued for roughly a half century. It was the lumbering era which built the great fortunes on which many of the wonderful activities of Pensacola were founded. And the story, of course, is one of families, of railroads, of rivers, of companies that came and went, and of course the story of the great virgin yellow pine as well. Now, to begin our story, we have to recognize that some very unique things happened in our world. About 10,000 years ago, at the end of the final ice age, a whole series of environmental things occurred here. First of all, after the ice recession, we had the growth for a time of great hardwood forests. After roughly 1,000 years, for reasons we cannot fully explain, those forests burned, and they left a unique ash covering on the earth. And onto that came the dropping of seeds, probably by the passage of birds, for the growth of what we then called the virgin yellow pine. Now, these were huge trees, not trees like we see in our forests along the road today, but trees with, massive bases, perhaps 175 to 200 feet high, and a single tree might give as much as 6,000 feet of finished lumber. Now, this forest was no small affair. It extended from about where Mobile is today to just to the west of Panama City, and then north well into what we now call the state of Alabama. It was a huge virgin yellow forest, and for centuries it stood. When the Native Americans were here, they barely touched it. When colonial America came and went, there was a tree cut here and there, but basically the forests themselves regenerated, and probably by the time the coming of DeLuna and the others, the forest was even greater than it had been before. So this was the beginning. And all through these colonial periods, virtually nothing happened. Now, we had the beginning of lumbering here, coming just before the time of Andrew Jackson. One of the first companies that was formed was by the Simpson family, Andrew and Ezekiel and their father, and they cut lumber along the Blackwater River. And when the coming of the fort building period began, they were among the very first of the contractors that served Colonel Chase in the building of the three forts. And of course, periodically during the fort building period, other lumber companies were formed, but they were all quite small. And when we came to the war between the states, Pensacola itself had these industries. They were cutting a little lumber. They were making a little turpentine off of naval stores, the sap and gum that was drawn from pine trees. And basically that was all that we used it for. It was a very modest amount of lumber cut and shipped to places like East Texas and the Caribbean, but it could hardly be called an industry. And then the war came, and of course, in the days and years immediately following the war, Pensacola, Northwest Florida, like the rest of the South, were literally on their economic knees. It was a very difficult period because the Southern currency, of course, had become worthless. The buildings and the industries, the businesses had been destroyed. They had to completely rebuild using their wits and great effort. But nothing much was happening until something happened in Europe. And this, of course, like so many parts of history, show that something can be of major interest for Pensacola, yet the button to start it was pushed far away. And this all began in Western Europe. Now, if we look at the period about the coming of the year 1870, we remember that the Industrial Revolution by that time was just about 100 years old. And when that revolution began, of course, industries were built, factories were built, and to gain the manpower for them, laws were passed which literally forced many people off the land. People who had been shepherds and small farmers, they were literally economically forced into cities where they went to work in the factories. And of course, there was no plan made for a good housing, for a good city planning of anything of that kind. And as a result, the cities in England, in France, in Germany, they became slums. And it was a very terrible thing. We had many different efforts, particularly in Great Britain, to overcome this, but mostly they failed. And then came the period of the 1869-71 war in France and Germany. At this point in time, those two countries did literally go to war. And of course, they had been in dispute on many times. And if we would to look at a current day exception to it. Our own odds makers out in Las Vegas, the beginning of that war, if they had existed then, would have said, well, the French are certain to win. They have the best looking uniforms. Their officer mustaches are much more attractive than the Germans. Germans look just sort of, they are plodding. What the odds makers and others did not realize was that in the prior 10 years, the new Chancellor of Germany, von Bismarck, and the first Kaiser, Wilhelm, had put together what we would today call a military and industrial complex. They had built Particularly, they had built railroads that allowed the movement of troops back and forth very quickly. And so when that war began between France and Germany, in a matter of weeks, the Germans prevailed. They moved into France, they captured Paris, and the world stood back and was shocked at what they had seen. Well, everyone sat back and said, well, how did they do this? Well, the answer was they had had planning, they had improved their infrastructure, and everyone said, well, if that is the case, then the Industrial Revolution, which we have been watching for a century, is going to last. It's for real. And what we have got to do, and whether it's Manchester, Liverpool, London, wherever it might be, we have got to rebuild our cities, make them better, make them available for more people. And as a consequence, to do that, of course, you had to have an ongoing supply of good building materials, principally lumber. Now, we have to stop at that point and remember that children, even children today, will remember that the stories that they are read from early on in early childhood often talk about the woodcutter. Woodcutter was a major profession all through Europe, and the reason, of course, that they cut wood was basically for housing, but mostly to heat their homes. People had to have wood to live through a winter season. And the result of that was that much of the available timber in many of these Western European countries had been cut. It was gone, and there were serious laws and serious offenses if one went in there and cut timber and made lumber out of, or firewood out of something that did not belong to them. So as a result, the fact that the cities had to be rebuilt made these various countries begin to look around and say, well, where can we find an ongoing source of good lumber? And they quickly discovered that the best place in the world, the most accessible in the world at that moment, was Northwest Florida. And consequently, the door opened for our lumbering era. Well, as it turned out, in the early part of 1871, Ezekiel Simpson and his new mill got the first order. And we must spend just a moment talking about that mill, because it's in itself is a story that deserves remembering. Ezekiel Simpson had a mill beginning as we mentioned earlier, beginning in the 1820s. It had been improved over at Pond Creek at Arcadia near the city of Milton. And then when new steam power became available to the Simpson family, Simpson moved his mill from Pond Creek over to the edge of the Blackwater River, built a brand new, beautiful mill that was state-of-the-art at that time. And of course, when the Confederate Army retreated from this area in 1862, the order was that all production, all inventories, anything that would give aid and comfort to the incoming Federals had to be destroyed. And Simpson's mill was burned. However, Simpson was smart. When he saw war clouds developing, he was a patriot, of course, and he said, I'm going to support the Southern cause as much as I can. However, I'm going to hedge my bet. And as a result of that, before war actually began, Simpson put a large sum of federal money in black suitcases, sent one of his aides by ship to New York, and they invested that money in federal bonds, which of course earned a substantial rate of interest all through the war. And when the war ended, Simpson had that supply of money, and he was able to take advantage of the new technologies which had developed during those 4 war years. And so, beginning in 1866, he had all the needs. He rebuilt his mill on the Blackwater, and just about the time that the first order arrived from England, Simpson's mill was ready, and they went into production and began shipping. Well, that order, of course, opened the door. And within a matter of months, other orders began to flood in. And when they did, of course, that meant that Pensacola, Northwest Florida, up as far as Brewton in South Alabama, all of these places began to take advantage of it. And to do that, of course, required more than Simpson's mill. So now, with the word out that this opportunity was here, men with capital and with lumbering experience began to come here. from places where they had been in lumbering, but where the opportunities now were beginning to shrink. And this included places like North Carolina, Maine, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. These people came, they brought their resources with them, and they brought experienced people. So but within a matter of about a year and a half to 2 years, we begin to see new mills begin to pop up. And they began all over the place. We had 2 of them that started right here on the banks of the river, of the bay in Pensacola. This was the George Washington Wright Mill, and then the Ricks Robinson Mill. They were right here in downtown Pensacola, practically within easy walking of downtown Pensacola. And then over on the Perdido, another set of mills began to be developed, and the principal ones there were the Southern States Lumber Company and the Ricks Robinson Mill established there with. And of course, even today, people wonder as they drive out Lillian Highway, they sometimes look to the right and they see these old stumps coming up out of the water. They, what in the world are those? How'd they get there? The answer is, of course, those stumps were where they were piling for the piers to which vessels would tie up when they came to get lumber from these 2 big mills over in that area. At the same time, of course, there was the need to transport some of this lumber, because it didn't all go out through the Perdido Bay area. Some of that lumber was going to go out through Pensacola. So even as all of this was coming together, a railroad was built, a short one. It was called the Pensacola and Perdido, 11 miles long, was built from that Perdido area, the Millview area, from there into Pensacola, where the railroad got a lease on land from the city of Pensacola and built their own docks at the foot of what we today call C Street. So all of these things you see were beginning. Now, we must stop also at this time and recognize that lumbering wasn't the only thing that was beginning to fuel the economic fire here in Pensacola. Also, by pure coincidence, I think we must say that, in 1870, the railroad between Pensacola and Flomaton was rebuilt. It had been destroyed, had been torn up by the retreating Confederates in 1862. By 1868, the city of Pensacola and other investors got further funding, and they rebuilt the road so that by the summer of 1870, the railroad was there. And by happy choice, by happy circumstance, I guess, another man who had copied another Floridian had put in our city here a beautiful new plant using German technology to produce ice mechanically. Now, the production of ice by mechanical means had been discovered back in the 1830s by a physician over at Apalachicola, a man named Dr. John Gorey, excuse me. But anyway, the idea had grown, the technology had grown, but by 1870, this new plant, built by a man named George Arras, was able to produce 20,000 pounds of ice a day. Now, you had a railroad, you had ice. That meant that someone could now come down from New England, who had this man having a series of a number of beautiful fishing smacks, and he could now begin to go out into the Gulf and catch snapper and grouper, another table fish, get them cut, cleaned, iced, and now they could now be shipped north on the railroad to places like Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Chicago. So you see, beginning in 1870, lumbering, railroading, fishing, ice, all of this begins to come into play, into focus in that 1 year, a kind of a magic year for Pensacola. And so all of this is beginning to happen. And of course, as it does, people begin to come into the city in huge numbers. We had about 3,000 people in the city when the war began in 1861. By 1865, the number was down somewhat from that. By 1870, that number had grown. We had almost 4,500. So you can see the entire population was growing as lumbering people began to come out of the north. They were coming down to fill this area. So all Pensacola was becoming a huge, prosperous area economically. We were something so different from the rest of the South. And that's the way the lumbering area and some of the others began. And on our next episode, we're going to talk about where some of these other mills were, and then, of course, how they produced lumber.